Welcome to Forever and Always Sweet Stories, where love gets messy, hearts get tangled, and somehow it all still ends in a swoon-worthy happily ever after. If you're into slow burns, heartfelt drama, and just enough charm to make you grin mid-laundry, you're exactly where you should be. New stories drop every week, so hit that subscribe button. Your future self will thank you. Chapter 1. The Letter. Wintercombe Hall was too quiet. Even the wind, always a presence on the Somerset moors, whispered instead of howled. Its gentler cousin, the kind that rustled the ivy on the west wing and tugged the bare branches of the orchard, seemed reluctant to disturb the silence inside the house. Lady Juliet Pembroke stood at the wide mullioned window of the morning room, her gloved fingers curled tightly around a letter. The fire crackled at her back, but she felt cold, as though the ink on the page had bled ice into her bones. She had let the fire burn lower than usual, out of habit, not oversight. Every stick of wood was accounted for these days, and even the staff had begun to ration it without asking. Wintercombe was still beautiful, but beneath the polish, everything frayed at the seams. She was the picture of restrained mourning, slender but soft in build, with a fragile seeming grace that belied her resolve. Her gown, high-waisted in the Empire fashion, was a shade between storm cloud and ash, 3 seasons old, but carefully mended. Her pale blonde hair was gathered into a smooth chignon, a few soft ringlets left to frame her delicately boned face. But it was her eyes that betrayed her. Hazel, sharply intelligent and edged with quiet exhaustion, they remained fixed on the closing lines of the letter. I shall arrive within the fortnight to inspect the estate and secure the household's affairs. Major Gabriel Pembroke, her late husband's cousin, whom she had never met, who now owned everything. She read the line again, as if it might soften with repetition. It didn't. The morning room still smelled faintly of rosemary and orange peel, left over from the boiled linen and the floor polish the housekeeper favoured after the spring thaw. And yet, beneath it, Juliet swore she could detect something sharper, more bitter. It was the scent of change. She folded the letter slowly, pressing the creases with careful precision, as though composure itself could be constructed from parchment and silence. She placed it beside the untouched teacup on the tray next to her, the once warm brew now dulled to the temperature of regret. Behind her the hall creaked, small footsteps. A pause. "Are you crying?" Juliet turned, smoothing her expression. "No, darling. Just reading." Edward stood in the doorway like a pint-sized sentry, arms crossed in that self-protective stance he'd adopted over the past 2 years. At 7, he had the sharp angles of a boy trying very hard to grow up too fast. His blonde hair flopped over his brow, and his hazel-green eyes, so like his father's, were narrowed in suspicion. James, 5 and still round-cheeked, peeked from behind his brother, clutching the tail of his threadbare stuffed lamb like a lifeline. He had the same fair Pembroke complexion, but with softer curls and bright blue eyes that hadn't yet dulled with loss. Juliet opened her arms. James ran into them without hesitation. Edward remained rooted to the threshold, his frown fierce. "Is someone coming?" Edward asked. He always listened when he wasn't meant to. Juliet considered a lie, then chose the gentlest truth. "Yes," she said. "A distant cousin of your father's, Major Pembroke." "Is he staying?" Edward asked, too sharply for a boy his age. Juliet's throat tightened. "For a little while." Edward's scowl deepened. "He's coming to take the house." "No one is taking anything," she said, too quickly to sound convincing. Edward didn't believe her. Neither did she. They were months, perhaps a year away from true desperation. But her savings were dwindling, and the tenants had begun to delay their rents. The war had bled even the countryside dry, and Thomas had died with more debts than assets. She had made do, dismissed 2 maids, sold off 3 of her husband's hunting rifles, replaced fresh flowers with dried ones from last year's garden. The cook stretched every meal now, asking careful questions about the pantry, and Juliet could no longer afford the silver polish used each Saturday. She had been raised to manage callers and parlour conversation, not ledgers and barley inventories. But somehow, for 2 years, she had survived on instinct alone. Until now. That night, after the boys were asleep, Juliet sat alone by the fire. Her shawl lay draped across her shoulders, and the shadows on the far wall shifted like silent dancers. Her tea had long gone cold. She let herself feel it then, the fear, quiet and bone deep. With her husband dead and the title passed beyond her sons, Wintercombe Hall no longer belonged to her. In law, it belonged to Gabriel Pembroke, a cousin of her late husband, now the rightful master of the estate. The entail had passed clean over Edward and James, bypassing youth in favour of seniority. A cruel rule, but a binding one. She had no claim. The boys had no future here, and Gabriel Pembroke could send them all away with a signature and a stamp. Juliet rose early the next morning and dressed with care in a soft grey wool gown trimmed with black velvet at the cuffs. A pearl mourning brooch pinned at her high neckline caught the dull morning light. Her hair, pale as cream, was braided and coiled with the practised elegance of habit. A single ringlet had escaped to rest against her cheek. She left it there. The staff moved through the house with the taut energy of a household awaiting judgment. At midday, the wind picked up. By late afternoon, the rain returned. He arrived at dusk. She heard the hooves before she saw him. Juliet stepped onto the wide stone steps of the front entrance, her cloak clasped at the throat. The boys flanked her, Edward to her right, stiff and wary, James clinging to her skirts on the left. They looked small against the backdrop of the house, and smaller still against the looming figure who rode through the gates. He approached on a tall black horse, rain slicking his greatcoat, his hair plastered to his forehead. The animal was restless beneath him, but the man rode with the easy stillness of a soldier, long accustomed to chaos. He dismounted without ceremony, murmured a word to the horse, and handed the reins to a waiting stable boy who'd appeared from the shadows of the drive. Gabriel Pembroke was tall, well over 6 feet with a soldier's frame, broad-shouldered, long-limbed, lean with strength. He wore a dark green coat fastened with brass buttons, rain clinging to the wool like mist. His cravat was neatly tied at the throat, his collar high, his bearing unmistakably military. There was no disarray, only the quiet discipline of a man accustomed to command. His face was angular, striking rather than handsome, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, cheekbones cut like flint, and pale grey eyes under dark brows that watched everything. His hair was wavy, chestnut brown, and slightly too long, as if he hadn't bothered to have it trimmed since leaving the regiment. The lines around his mouth suggested a man who smiled rarely and meant it less often when he did. He took the steps slowly, like a man measuring unfamiliar ground. Juliet stepped forward. "Major Pembroke?" He nodded once, rain dripping from his shoulders. "Lady Pembroke." His voice was low and quiet, with a Highland burr that softened the edges of his words, subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't the voice of London or Parliament. It was something older, rougher, real. "You're welcome to Wintercombe Hall," she said, her tone polite but measured. He glanced past her, eyes sweeping the hall, then returned his gaze to hers. "You've my thanks for the welcome," he said, "though I imagine it comes with some reservations." Juliet lifted her chin. One doesn't always have the luxury of giving only what one chooses. One of his eyebrows lifted, barely. Not a smile, but not unamused. Behind her, Edward stepped forward, shoulders squared with more courage than tact. "We don't need you here," the boy said flatly. Juliet's breath caught. Gabriel looked down at Edward. His expression shifted, not unkind, but appraising. His grey eyes sharpened, but his voice remained even. "That's fair," he said quietly. He walked past them without waiting to be shown the way. His boots echoed on the marble tiles of the entryway, each step deliberate. The air he brought with him smelled of rain, leather, and cold resolve. He didn't glance back. Juliet remained on the steps, the boys close at her sides. The rain had eased, but the storm had already arrived. Chapter 2. The Supper Table Showdown. Juliet had always believed in the power of the supper table. It was where a household found its rhythm, and where even the hardest days could be made gentler by warmth and shared bread. But tonight, the table was a battlefield. The long dining room, once the pride of the house, felt twice its size under the strained silence. The velvet curtains at the tall windows were drawn against the rain, but the damp crept in anyway. Candlelight shimmered on silver that had been polished just enough to make it passable. The tablecloth had been mended discreetly with ivory thread. At one end sat Juliet, composed and graceful in a soft grey gown with black silk piping at the sleeves. At the other, Gabriel Pembroke, silent and unreadable, his shoulders too broad for the high-backed dining chair. His dark green coat had been changed for a black wool jacket, plain and slightly frayed at the cuffs. His shirt was crisp, but Juliet noted that his collar wasn't stiffened, an old military habit, perhaps. He ate with the quiet, efficient manners of a man who saw meals as necessities, not ceremonies. Between them sat Edward and James, both boys upright in their chairs, faces stiff with effort. The boys had been coached, bribed with jam tarts if they were polite. But tension had replaced appetite. The only sound was the soft clink of forks on porcelain and the rattle of rain against the windows. Finally, Gabriel spoke. "Your cook's skilled," he said, nodding once at the roast chicken on his plate. Juliet blinked. Not the words she expected, but not unpleasant. "We've managed with a smaller staff these days," she said. "Mrs. Thorne sees to the household, and more than her share besides." "Aye, loyal service." He glanced at the boys. "Hard to come by." Edward stiffened. Juliet saw it before the boy even realised he was responding. "We're loyal," Edward said, a little too loud, "to our father." Gabriel looked at him, not sharply, but directly. "As ye should be." There was no sarcasm in his tone, no challenge, but neither was there softness. A heavier silence settled over the table. James reached for a roll but seemed to forget it halfway, his small fingers hesitating. Juliet steadied the plate for him. Across from them, Edward nudged his carrots in slow circles, silent and withdrawn. Gabriel leaned back slightly, observing. "I'll not disturb your routine more than necessary," he said, "but I'll need access to the ledgers and tenancy rolls." "You shall have it," Juliet replied, then added, "though I'd prefer you consult me before altering anything concerning the tenants. Many have struggled since the war. Several lost sons." Gabriel's expression didn't change, but there was a pause, a flicker. "I know," he said quietly. And for the first time, Juliet wondered how many of those lost sons he'd buried with his own hands. The meal ended with stewed apples and buttered sponge cake, humble but sweet. James finally smiled, just once, when Juliet offered him a second slice. Edward refused dessert. Gabriel did not. "Thank you," he said after his final bite, dabbing his mouth with his napkin. "I've not had a meal like this in years." There was something in the way he said it that made Juliet pause. Surely the officers' mess in Spain had its refinements. He gave a faint snort. The last officers' mess I sat in had 1 tin spoon between 4 men, and a fire made of olive branches and bad luck. That was the closest thing to a joke he had said all evening. Edward gave a begrudging, curious glance. James watched him now with open fascination. After supper, Gabriel stood as Juliet rose, a touch stiffly, as if unused to formal dining. He inclined his head to the boys. "Good night, lads." Edward nodded, silent. James offered a shy, "Night, sir." Gabriel turned to Juliet and gave her a proper bow, low, crisp, surprisingly elegant. "Lady Pembroke. Major." Then he was gone, boots echoing into the shadows of the hallway. Juliet let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. She reached for the boys, herding them gently toward the stairs, but her mind remained fixed on the chair at the other end of the table. The man who now owned her home. The man who had spoken of fire and olive branches. The man who did not smile, but had taken a second helping of cake. She could not decide if he was her enemy or just another form of loss. Either way, he was here, and he was staying. The breakfast room was Juliet's favourite in the house. Modest in size, warm in tone, it faced the east gardens and filled with morning light even on grey days. The wallpaper was faded cream with a thistle motif, and the rug beneath the table had been a wedding gift from Thomas's aunt in Bath. Too vibrant to be stylish, but too sentimental to discard. Juliet poured tea into the delicate porcelain cups, then added warm milk for the boys. Toast and blackcurrant preserves sat under a linen cover, and the scent of mushrooms stewed in butter mingled with the warmth of fresh eggs and toasted bread. Edward sat stiffly in his chair, refusing to speak. James leaned sleepily against his folded arms, his cheek red with pillow marks. The door opened. Gabriel entered. This time his cravat was properly tied, though clearly not by a valet. His dark coat fit him better today, still simple, but brushed and buttoned. His boots were clean. He looked less like a threat, more like a man trying to pass for a gentleman. Juliet rose from instinct. "Good morning, Major." "Good morning," he said with a faint nod. He glanced at the boys. "Lads." Edward did not reply. James offered a tentative, "Good morning, sir." Gabriel walked to the sideboard and served himself without ceremony. 1 slice of toast, eggs, and a generous helping of mushrooms. No sweets, no jam. A soldier's breakfast. Juliet gestured to the chair at the foot of the table. "Please." Gabriel sat. The clink of cutlery began again. For several minutes, the only sound was the gentle scrape of butter on toast and the rattle of a teacup in its saucer. Then, "Did you know our father?" Edward asked suddenly. Juliet's hand stilled. Gabriel didn't look up. He finished chewing his bite of toast, then replied, "No. I met him once when we were boys. He was older than me. We were strangers." Edward narrowed his eyes. "Then why do you get his house?" Juliet opened her mouth, but Gabriel raised a hand, a small gesture. He wasn't offended. "Because that's how English law works," he said simply. "Titles and land pass to the next male heir. I didn't ask for it. But you took it." Gabriel looked at Edward then, not unkindly. I did." "You could give it to us," Edward muttered. Gabriel's voice dropped just slightly. "And what would you do with it, lad? You're 7, and not yet ready to manage an estate." "I would take care of my mother." Juliet flinched. Gabriel didn't respond immediately. He sat back, his grey eyes fixed on the boy in silence. Not with contempt, with something quieter. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. "I'm sure you would," he said at last. James stirred beside Juliet. "I had a dream last night," he mumbled. Gabriel looked to him. "What kind?" "There was a fox in the orchard," James said sleepily. "It had red eyes and it talked." Juliet smiled faintly. "What did it say?" James yawned. "That it wanted pie." Gabriel huffed, not quite a laugh, but something. "You'll need to be careful then," he said to James. "Foxes who talk are clever and hungry." The boy smiled. Edward scowled harder. Juliet's gaze flicked between them all. Something had shifted in the room. Gabriel finished his tea and stood. "I'll speak with the steward this morning," he said, "and walk the west fields. The stone walls crumbling near the sheep pasture." Juliet stood as well. "Yes, it's been on the list. We haven't had a mason since last autumn." "I'll send for one." A pause. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once more. Then, as he left, he glanced once, just once, back at Edward. Not as a warning, but perhaps as a challenge. When the door closed behind him, Juliet let out a breath. James whispered, "I don't think he's mean." Edward shot him a look. "He's trying to trick us." Juliet folded her hands in her lap. Perhaps, she thought. Or perhaps he doesn't know himself what he wants yet. Chapter 3. Footsteps Beyond the Gate. Juliet tied her bonnet and leather gloves, stepping out the south door before dawn, the house still steeped in the scent of brewing tea. Her boots sunk into thawing earth. Spring came late to Somerset, yet the day felt somehow lighter. She cherished the solitude. It gave her room to think. The land weighed on her most. The roof could be repaired, walls replastered. But the estate's grounds, once the pride of Pembroke, were unravelling. Fences sagged, the western pasture's stone wall was collapsing, slowly, inch by inch. Tenant farms, 4 in all, hadn't paid in full since autumn. Walking past the old orchard, she noted how few trees had budded. Once fruitful, it now struggled to yield even leaves. Her breath clouded the air as she halted at the gate. A branch cracked softly. She turned, and there was Gabriel standing just beyond the fence line, boots damp with mud, a thick wool coat thrown over his shoulders, his hat tucked beneath one arm. No warning, no announcement. "You're up early," she said. "So are you." He stepped through the gate and joined her on the narrow path among the silent trees. The orchard was hushed, save for a few distant crows. "I come here most mornings," she said, after a pause. "It's the one calm place." "They don't look weak," he said quietly, looking at the apple trees. "Just tired." She nodded. "We dismissed the gardener 2 years ago. Couldn't afford him, roof or orchard." He glanced at her. "You've managed all of this yourself? The land, the tenants, the accounts?" "With help from the steward," she replied. "But final decisions, mine." He paused. "It's more than I expected." "Because I'm a woman?" she asked dryly. "Because it's bloody hard work," he said. His words struck her more than any insult might. They walked in silence for a moment. "It's a good estate," he said gently. "The bones are strong." "But bones don't harvest wheat," she replied softly. "Or pay debts." He looked at her then, at the woman who had quietly held this place together. "I'd like to keep walking," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "A request or an order?" He allowed a flicker of humour. "A truce." She considered, then nodded. "Very well." They continued between the rows, 2 strangers in thawing fields neither had chosen, seeking footing on uncertain ground. Juliet was returning from the orchard when Mrs. Thorne intercepted her in the hall, a gentleman's hat held primly in both hands. "A caller, my lady," she said. Lord Halverston. He's in the blue drawing room. Of course he was. Juliet pulled off her gloves slowly. Did he say what this visit concerns? No, my lady. Merely that he was in the area. He never was. Polished, tall, impeccably dressed, Halverston rose and addressed her with familiar civility. Lady Pembroke, a fine morning for a visit. He spoke of riding past the south field, observing that she'd been rather quiet lately, and wondered if all this disruption weighed on her. Juliet stood straight. Curious, I wasn't aware I appeared distressed. He smiled with gentle condescension, suggesting that a woman of her refinement might welcome a more secure arrangement. He then implied that her tenure at the estate could be temporary, that soon the rightful heir, Major Pembroke, Gabriel, might wish to make use of his inheritance. It was only proper, he suggested, for her to retire to a smaller house, or, ideally, a new household entirely. Before she could answer, a quiet voice came from the doorway. Lady Pembroke has kept this place standing, against the odds. Gabriel stood in the threshold, his mud-splattered coat unmistakable. Halverston's polite smile faltered, surprise, perhaps annoyance. Major Pembroke, he greeted stiffly. Gabriel bowed. My lord? Juliet interjected smoothly. Lord Halverston has long served as Justice of the Peace. He's well acquainted with the rhythms of the county. Gabriel gave a short nod. Then perhaps he'll know where to find a reliable mason. The western wall's crumbling. Halverston raised a brow. Surely your steward would handle such matters. I like to see things for myself. There was a brief silence. Halverston pressed on. You've done your duty, Juliet. No one could deny it. But the burden of managing such a place must be exhausting. I should think any reasonable gentleman would want to see you settled, secure. His voice softened just slightly. I dare say many would consider it a privilege to offer that protection. She gave a thin smile. What a comfort to be offered shelter from a house I built. Gabriel stirred then, just enough to shift the silence. She's not going anywhere, he said evenly. Halverston's eyes flicked toward him. That will be your choice, Major, of course. Gabriel didn't blink. Aye, it will. Juliet stepped forward, gathering her calm like a shawl. Thank you for calling, Lord Halverston. I'm sure your sister's gathering will be a great success. Please convey my regards. He bowed low, lips pressed. As always, Lady Pembroke. And then he was gone. Gabriel hadn't moved. His gaze stayed on the window, unreadable. Juliet spoke, low. You didn't need to say that. I did. People will talk. They already are. His voice was steady, unbothered. She turned toward him. I can't have them thinking I've stayed by your permission. He looked at her then. Haven't you? There was no accusation in it. Just fact, measured and quiet. She drew a breath. The boys have every right to remain. This is their inheritance, their home. Her voice thinned slightly, but I'm not entitled to it. Not legally. Not in any way that counts once the will is settled. He was silent, his expression unreadable. She held his gaze. Whether I belong here or not, that's what everyone's waiting to see, isn't it? Another pause. Then Gabriel spoke, evenly. I've made no decision. Juliet's voice was steady. Then you'll forgive me if I go on behaving as though I still have a place. Later, in the steward's office, Mr. Sims examined the ledgers beneath pale light. His shoulders hunched, coat worn at the elbows. He stood up as Juliet entered. Forgive the disorder, my lady, he began, adjusting his spectacles. I was reconciling the March accounts. You needn't stand on ceremony, she replied softly. He reseated himself and covered the ledger gently, as if shielding it from her eyes. "Has something come up?" she asked. His expression tightened. "Ash Tree Farm. I've had word that Mr. Hambleton and his family left today. Their lease wasn't up for 4 months." "Gone?" "Yes. No formal notice. Cart packed. Key left on the stoop." Juliet's throat constricted. "Do you know why?" He shook his head. "Rising costs, poor harvest, and resentment. Some villagers suspect the new master, a Scottish officer, may not care for Wintercombe as one of their own." Gabriel entered without a word, his boots still damp, his coat streaked with soil from the orchard. He glanced between Juliet and the ledger. "I knocked," he said. Juliet nodded. "Come in. You should hear this." "The tenants from Ash Tree Farm have left." Gabriel stepped forward. "They passed me on the road this morning. Cart half loaded, wife holding a cradle. It looked like retreat." Sims looked down. "There's unrest, sir. People don't take well to change." Gabriel glanced at the ledger. "Do they owe anything?" "A quarter's rent," Sims said, "but it's likely lost." Gabriel's brow creased. "How many others are behind?" Juliet's voice was steady. 18 out of 24, but most are only a month or 2 behind. Gabriel folded his arms. "That's 3/4 of the estate in arrears." "We've managed," Juliet said, firmer now. "Some paid in goods, wool, cider, potatoes. It's not ideal, but it kept things going." Gabriel met her gaze. "That's not sustainable." "They've lived here for generations," she said. "Weathered wars, failed harvests, taxes they couldn't afford. They've earned patience." Gabriel's tone didn't rise, but it sharpened. "A family left in the night and gave no word. That's not hardship, that's abandonment." Sims shifted. "We can't start threatening them." Gabriel looked to Juliet. "If we ignore this, the rest will follow. One cart rolling out invites another." Juliet's jaw tightened. "We'll speak to them, personally, tenant by tenant." Gabriel held her gaze for a beat. "Agreed." She studied him, then gave a single nod. "But I lead the way." Chapter 4. The Edges of Belonging. Juliet found the letter waiting on the salver in the hall, addressed in Lady Atherton's crisp, elegant hand. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she carried it into the study, where the morning sun filtered through narrow windows and painted pale gold across the rug. She stood there a moment, weighing the thing in her hand. Not heavy, not thick, but somehow dense. When she finally broke the seal, her eyes flicked down the page in practiced quiet. Lady Atherton never wasted ink. "My dear Juliet, I trust this finds you well. I hear from Miss Pritchard that your cousin by marriage has arrived and taken up residence, as expected. I hope the adjustment has been as smooth as can be managed under the circumstances. Forgive my bluntness, but I write with care. It has been noted, not unkindly, that you remain at Wintercombe Hall. Naturally, no one questions your grace or service, but perhaps it is time to consider future arrangements. If I may be of assistance in securing a modest residence in Bath or Somerset, I would be glad to inquire on your behalf. With all warmth, Lady Atherton." Juliet folded the letter without a sound and set it down beside the silver inkwell. Her fingers grazed the edge of the polished desk, smooth, familiar, lovingly dusted by Mrs. Thorne every Thursday afternoon for 3 years. That morning, she and Gabriel had walked to Briar Row, a half-mile lane of cottages near the edge of the estate. Their first tenant call. Juliet had worn her plainest bonnet and a faded pelisse of slate-blue wool. The road had been muddy, the trees thin with early spring, and Gabriel's boots still bore the traces of pruning work from the orchard. He had not spoken much. At the first door, it had been she who knocked, and she who spoke. The tenant, Mrs. Dobbin, had been startled to see them. but invited them in at once. Tea had been brewed, quickly and awkwardly, and Gabriel had bent low under the eaves of the cottage to accept the cracked cup with surprising gentleness. He'd let Juliet ask the questions about the potatoes, the hens, the water barrel. And when Mr. Dobbin finally returned from the field and looked him square in the face, Gabriel had met his gaze steadily and said, "I'm not here to sweep the bones from the hearth. I only want to understand how things stand." It was the first time Juliet had seen the man nod. Back in the present, she turned from the desk and crossed the room. Her eyes swept the shelves. Books she had not opened in months, maps, her late husband's collection of geological sketches. Nothing had changed, and everything had. She found Gabriel in the yard behind the stables, sleeves rolled and coat tossed over a post. He was speaking with the farrier, not ordering but listening, nodding once, twice, his arms folded across his chest. His shirt sleeves were damp at the cuffs and smudged with soot near the elbow. Juliet waited until the farrier had gone before speaking. "You've acquired the confidence of the smith," she said lightly. "That's a high honour." Gabriel wiped his hands on a rag and glanced up. He's got a good eye for lameness. Doesn't speak unless he needs to. She held out the letter. He took it without a word, reading quickly. When he finished, he looked up. "Do you want to leave?" "No." He folded the letter and handed it back. "Then stay." "It's not that simple." Gabriel's brow furrowed. "You're not under obligation to answer to the Athertons of the world. I'm under obligation to appearances, and reputation, and to my boys." She tucked the letter back into her sleeve. Gabriel looked at her then. Really looked. "This is their home." "And yours?" "I've had it for 5 minutes. You've kept it for years." The wind stirred the yard. Juliet looked toward the rising fields, where the orchard trees stood bare and braced, waiting for spring. She said softly, "There will come a point when the servants begin referring to me as the previous mistress, when my tea is served in a smaller pot, when someone else stands at the head of the table." Gabriel didn't flinch. "You think I want that?" She didn't answer. He wiped the soot from his fingers slowly. "The house is large enough for both of us. For now." "For now," she echoed. They stood in silence as the wind shifted again, lifting the scent of horses and earth into the crisp March air. "Damn it," Gabriel muttered, not loud but sharp enough to startle the silence. He hadn't called for anyone, but Mrs. Thorne appeared all the same, drawn by the break in his composure. Juliet had just reached the stair when the sound carried, low, sharp, utterly unlike him. She turned at once and descended quickly, skirts brushing the banister, dread rising with each step. When Juliet entered the study, Gabriel stood behind the desk, motionless. Before him lay a ruined map. Navy ink bled across the parchment, soaking into careful notations, blurring days of work. The inkwell lay shattered beside it. "I found it like this," he said. His voice was calm, but the edge beneath it was sharp and unmistakable. Juliet took in the scene, the oak desk, the spreading stain, the bitter scent of ink. "Perhaps it was an accident," she said quietly. Gabriel looked up, jaw tight. "You think I did this?" "No, of course not. I only meant maybe one of the maids." "Mrs. Thorne says the door was closed." Juliet hesitated. "Then perhaps the latch—" "I left it open. I meant to come back." He looked down at the ruined map. "Someone shut it, and someone was here." A pause. Then from the doorway, Mrs. Thorne cleared her throat. "Shall I fetch more ink, sir?" "No, thank you. I'll manage." She glanced at Juliet, quiet sympathy or warning, then withdrew. Gabriel exhaled. "If the boys were in here—" "They weren't," Juliet said quickly. "They know better." Do they? Yes, she said, firmer now. His gaze held hers, not unkind, but resolute. Then I'd prefer they stay out of the study from now on. Juliet crossed to the desk, more from habit than purpose. She looked down at the ink-stained map. I'm sorry. A beat passed. You don't know it was them. I don't, he said, but I know what it cost. Without another word, he drew a fresh sheet from the drawer and began again. Juliet stood a moment longer, unsure if she felt accused or ashamed. Then she turned and left him to his silence. The boys were in the nursery when she found them, crouched behind a barricade of cushions. Wooden soldiers lay scattered across the rug. One of the toy horses was headless. Juliet said nothing. She crossed to the hearth, knelt, and met Edward's gaze. He didn't move. James's cheeks were flushed, hands tucked behind his back. A smear of ink marked the table by the window. Another stained the curtain hem. She glanced at James's cuff, blue-black and blooming. She reached gently for his sleeve. James. He flinched. What is this? He shrugged. Nothing. You weren't drawing. No reply. Juliet turned to Edward. He didn't look away. I told him not to pour it, he said flatly. She went still. You poured the ink? James burst in. He didn't stop me. Juliet sank back. Why? Silence. Then Edward said, because he's not our father. A beat. James's voice came sharper. He doesn't belong here. Juliet's stomach turned. So you destroyed his map? We didn't break anything else, James muttered. No, she said coldly. Just his trust. She rose. What if it had been your father's map? Edward's voice was barely a whisper. Papa wouldn't have sent us away. Her throat tightened. She sat on the bed, her voice low but unwavering. You will stay out of the study. You will write letters of apology. And tomorrow morning you will deliver them. In person. James frowned. He won't care. Juliet's tone was firm. He will. And so will you. That evening, once the house had settled into silence, Juliet returned to the study. Gabriel sat alone at the desk, a clean map unfurled before him. He looked up. They did it, she said. Did they say why? She gave a quiet, rueful laugh. Because you're not their father. Because they're angry. Because you're here. And he isn't. Gabriel nodded. Fair reasons, if you're 7 and furious. I'm not excusing it. I know. They'll apologize in the morning. They don't have to. I need them to. She crossed to the hearth. They're not just frightened, Gabriel. They're furious. And if I'm honest, so am I. He didn't answer, but something in his posture eased, shoulders lowering slightly, the map forgotten under his hand. This house, she said softly, has become a battleground. He exhaled dryly. Then let's not fight blind. Juliet looked at him, tired, ink-stained, a stranger becoming something else. Good night, Major, she said. He nodded. Lady Pembroke. She left him there, alone with the map, and the shape of a war he hadn't meant to start. Chapter 5. Manners and Mending. It was a grey morning, with the sort of stillness that made everything feel more serious than it was. Juliet had dressed the boys in their best jackets, brushed their hair smooth, and made them practice the words twice in the corridor. They had complained, sulked, whispered that he wouldn't care anyway. But now that they stood outside the study door, neither boy spoke. Juliet knocked once, lightly. Come in, came Gabriel's voice from within. She turned the handle. The boys followed her in like two small prisoners approaching a judge's bench, both solemn, both stiff, but with very different faces. Edward's was composed, hard set. James's looked pink and watery around the edges, his lower lip tucked resolutely under his teeth. Gabriel sat at the desk, reading glasses perched low on his nose, a pencil in hand. He looked up and rose as they entered. Juliet gave him a slight nod and stepped aside. James glanced up at her, then back at Gabriel, then down again. No one spoke. Finally, Juliet murmured, "Go on, boys." James gave his brother a desperate look. Edward, older and marginally braver, stepped forward. "We came to apologize," he said, almost too quickly. Gabriel said nothing. We were angry," Edward continued, "about everything, and we shouldn't have touched your map. It wasn't ours." James cleared his throat, blinked fast and mumbled, "Sorry about the ink." Gabriel still said nothing, just studied them both for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he looked down, opened the desk drawer, and pulled out a rolled sheet of parchment. "I've redrawn it," he said mildly, "but it took a while, especially since I had to guess at your father's old survey notes." The boys froze. Juliet flinched slightly. Gabriel met Edward's gaze. "You know your father once mapped this entire valley by hand, don't you?" Edward nodded, his throat working. "He had an eye for it," Gabriel said, "and a steady hand." James's voice came small and tight. "So do we." Gabriel looked at him, surprised maybe. He didn't smile exactly, but the edge of his expression softened. "In that case," he said slowly, "I may have a task for you." Edward blinked. "Us." Gabriel moved to the cabinet near the hearth, opened it, and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook and a stub of charcoal. "I'm surveying the South Orchard this week," he said. "It's grown over in parts. I could use help keeping a straight line and holding things. Quiet help, preferably." The boys looked at Juliet. She raised her brows, silently granting permission. Edward turned back to Gabriel. "All right." James shuffled forward, just enough to reach the edge of the desk. "I can carry the paper," he said shyly. Gabriel gave him a small, approving nod. "Well then," he said, "we'll start after the rain clears." Juliet let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The boys shuffled out of the room without protest, though James shot one last, searching glance back at Gabriel before the door closed behind them. Juliet lingered. "Thank you," she said softly. Gabriel didn't look up from the desk as he rolled the map back into its tube. For what? For meeting them halfway. Gabriel glanced up then. A brief, dry flicker of a smile ghosted at the corner of his mouth. "You're wrong," he said. "They met me." By midday, the rain had passed, leaving the orchard damp and fragrant. Clouds still clung to the hills, and the last drizzle beaded on twisted apple branches like pearls. Gabriel was already outside when the boys arrived, Edward in a patched jacket, James trailing behind in boots a size too large. Juliet watched from the front steps, arms crossed, heart tight with a mother's worry. She hadn't followed. Not yet. Gabriel looked up, a measuring pole over one shoulder, surveyor's rope in hand. "No uniforms today," he said dryly. Edward shrugged. "We're not soldiers." "Not yet," Gabriel said. James grinned. They got to work. Gabriel showed them how to stretch the rope and drive stakes, how to watch for snags and mark the ground. Edward kept the notebook. James held the line taut. "You want it steady like this," Gabriel said. "Any slack throws the whole thing off." They nodded, seriously. Later, Juliet followed the orchard path, boots brushing wet leaves. She found them near the far fence, Gabriel at the rope's end, Edward frowning over a crooked sketch, James pointing to mushrooms at the base of a tree. She didn't speak. Not at first. There was something in the way they stood. Still strangers, but beginning to move in rhythm. Gabriel noticed her. He nodded. "I didn't think you'd be out so long," she said. "The ground's worse than I thought," he replied. They were a help. Edward's cheeks were smudged with charcoal. James's boots were soaked. Both looked tired and proud. "We carried the rope all the way down," James said. 3 full lines. "No slack," Gabriel added. "Perfect form." Juliet lifted a brow. "High praise, Major Pembroke." He almost smiled. The boys walked ahead, James chattering, Edward holding the rope like a standard. Juliet lingered. "They like you," she said. "I haven't earned that." "You might be close." A breeze stirred the branches. An apple dropped at their feet, bruised and half-wormed. "Not everything survives winter," Gabriel murmured. Juliet glanced at him. "Some things surprise you." They stood a moment longer, then turned toward the path. The kitchen had created a feast, far more generous than anything Juliet had seen in weeks. She paused in the corridor before entering, a faint scent of cloves and roasted meat reaching her before the door even opened. They hadn't eaten this well since before Thomas died. The dining room, modest but warm, glowed in the low light of early evening. Juliet's eyes widened slightly as she took in the table. Roast beef, crisp golden potatoes, buttered peas, a dish of roasted apples spiced with nutmeg. All prepared as if the family were expecting company, or perhaps celebrating something quietly among themselves. She had not requested any of it. Gabriel stood as she entered. He wore no cravat tonight, only a simple dark waistcoat and shirt sleeves rolled once at the wrist. His hair was still damp from the orchard, and his thumb bore a faint smudge of charcoal. The boys were already halfway through their second helpings of roast beef and crisp roasted potatoes, James looking particularly pleased with himself as he used bread to mop up a rich gravy. Juliet took her seat across from Gabriel. He nodded once and resumed his meal with quiet efficiency. 2 slices of beef, 3 potatoes, a precise spoonful of peas. She studied the food again, then glanced at him. "Did Mrs. Thorne—" Gabriel didn't look up. "I left her a few coins for the pantry. Told her to have cook prepare something hearty. She took it as a challenge." Juliet blinked. "You didn't need to do that." "I know." "But you did," she thought. There was no further mention of it, but something in her chest shifted. A knot she hadn't realized was there, loosening ever so slightly. There was wine, too, mulled with orange peel and cinnamon, poured into small, silver-rimmed goblets that caught the light. Juliet watched the way the fire glinted off the glass, how the warmth of it curled in her hands. She had missed this, not luxury, but comfort. Across the table, Edward looked up from his plate. "Are we going out again tomorrow?" "That depends on whether your boots have dried," Gabriel replied. "I can oil them tonight," Edward said seriously, "and James can help roll the line." James opened his mouth to protest but was too busy chewing a mouthful of potato to speak. Juliet hid a smile behind her goblet. "You've created monsters, Major." Gabriel sliced into his beef and said, not unkindly, "I've served with worse." The boys, tired and well-fed, eventually grew quieter, and Juliet gave them leave to bring their plum tarts to the nursery. James lingered just long enough to tuck one in a napkin and sneak a second glance at Gabriel, a look more curious than wary now, before retreating. When the door closed, the dining room felt suddenly larger and quieter. Gabriel sat back, his wine untouched, his gaze turned toward the fire. "You know," he said after a moment, I've never lived in a house with children. Juliet sipped her wine. You hide it well. I'm learning, he said. Then, after a pause, it's more complicated than the army. Juliet laughed, startled. More mud, certainly. He smiled at that. Not a ghost of one, but a real, crooked thing that made him look suddenly younger. Less carved from stone. I can see why you're proud of them, he said. They're intelligent, independent. Juliet toyed with the stem of her goblet. They miss their father, but they won't say it. Gabriel nodded. That never goes away. You just get better at hiding it. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, the fire snapping gently in the grate. The roasted apples sent a warm, spiced scent through the room. Juliet finally said, You could have sent them away, you know, after the ink. Gabriel met her eyes. I thought about it. Her brow lifted. He shrugged. But then I thought, if I were 7 and angry, I'd have done the same. Juliet tilted her head. Were you angry at 7? Furious. A beat passed. She set her goblet down. What changed? Gabriel's gaze dropped to the table. Nothing. I just got taller. That made her laugh. Soft, surprised, the kind that slipped out before she could stop it. He looked up then, and there was something unreadable in his eyes. I'm glad you stayed for supper, she said. Gabriel replied simply, So am I. Chapter 6. An Uninvited Caller. The letter arrived just after breakfast, stiff with formality and sealed in red wax. Mrs. Thorne set it beside Juliet's plate with an expression of mild distaste. From Linfield House, madam. Their footman looked down his nose at Robert like we keep pigs at the door. Juliet picked up the envelope and ran her thumb over the seal. The handwriting was unmistakable, as was the tone already curling at the edges. Dear Lady Pembroke, it has been too long. I find myself unexpectedly in the district and will call upon you this afternoon if convenient. Yours in affection, Agatha Linfield, née Talbot. Juliet lowered the page and exhaled slowly. Friend? Gabriel asked from across the room, where he sat polishing the brass telescope he'd had shipped in last week. Not exactly. Juliet folded the letter, then reconsidered and folded it again. A cousin by marriage? One of Thomas's better-dressed relatives. Gabriel looked amused. And she's coming today. So she says. Juliet moved toward the window, then stopped, turning sharply toward him. I'm asking you to be well-dressed and on your best behavior, she said. This woman writes to people who matter. The wrong impression could cause real trouble. I've never been anything but well-behaved, he said, eyes gleaming. I'm serious, Gabriel. I'll be a model of English propriety, he replied solemnly. She narrowed her eyes. Lady Agatha Linfield arrived just after 2 o'clock in a coach that gleamed with polish and ambition. Her hat was an absurd construction of feathers and netting, her expression beneath it mildly horrified. Juliet greeted her in the drawing room with practiced warmth. How lovely to see you, she said. It's been years. Yes, Agatha replied, sweeping in as though she owned the rugs. So much has changed. Her gaze darted over the furnishings, clearly noting the worn upholstery, the fading drapes, the tray of tea that lacked silver. Footsteps sounded in the hall. Juliet turned, just as Gabriel entered. He wore a deep blue Highland tartan kilt, pressed and formal, paired with a dark waistcoat, a plain linen shirt, and a jacket that looked somehow more regal than military. His hair was neatly combed, his boots gleamed, and his expression was dangerously neutral. Juliet's stomach dropped. Agatha blinked. You must be the Major. I hadn't realised the family line stretched quite so far north. Gabriel gave her a low, perfectly executed bow. "Aye, madam. All the way to the heathered hills and sheep that speak Latin." Juliet could feel her heartbeat in her teeth. Agatha turned slightly toward her. "I find regional dress so quaint. It must be very freeing." Juliet smiled, tight-lipped. He's always been particular about tradition. Gabriel said little, but his occasional "aye, madam" had enough Highland lilt to make Juliet want to strangle him with his sash. The tea was hot, the conversation lukewarm, and the judgment ice-cold. When Agatha finally departed, trailing perfume and disapproval, Juliet didn't sit. She marched into the hallway and turned to Gabriel. "You did that on purpose?" Gabriel raised a brow. "You said to dress properly. That was my best jacket." "You wore a kilt to antagonize her." "Perhaps," he said, brushing imaginary lint from his cuff. "But you can't say it wasn't well received. I believe she stopped breathing for a full minute." Juliet's tone dropped. "She'll write to everyone. She'll suggest there's impropriety in the house, that I'm keeping company with some rugged Highland rogue." "Well," he said with a maddening half-smile, "she wouldn't be wrong." She stared at him, furious and flustered. "You might think this is amusing," she said, "but I still have a reputation to consider." Gabriel's smile faded. "Is that all you have to consider?" Juliet blinked. "Excuse me." He looked at her, truly looked, and the moment turned. Not playful now, but quieter, edged. "You act like it's only appearances that matter," he said, "as though you have nothing else to lose." Juliet crossed her arms. "And what would you know about that?" A beat. "I know what it is to be treated like you don't belong in your own bloodline," he said. "And I know what it is to hide your heart behind manners." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. "I have work to do," she said stiffly, turning back toward the drawing room. Juliet couldn't sleep. She told herself it was the boys. James had kicked off his blanket last night, and Edward had talked in his sleep once or twice. But that wasn't what kept her up. She blamed the draft in the corridor. The remnants of Agatha's voice still curling around her mind like ivy. The ache behind her eyes. But when she passed the nursery and both boys were sound asleep, when she lit a candle instead of returning to her room, she had to admit the truth. It was him. She drifted down the stairs in her wrapper, wool over her nightgown, quiet as a cat. Her intention had been the kitchen. Perhaps tea, a biscuit, if there was anything left. But the light under the study door stopped her. She hesitated, then pushed it open. Gabriel was there, seated in one of the two leather chairs by the hearth. The fire was low but steady, casting long amber shadows across the floor. He had removed his jacket. His shirt was open at the collar, sleeves rolled to the forearms. One boot lay discarded by the hearth, the other half unlaced. His elbow rested on the armrest. A glass of whiskey sat untouched in his hand. He looked up, surprised, but not startled. She stood framed in the doorway, candlelight brushing over her features. Her hair, unpinned for the night, was gathered in a single long braid that slipped over her shoulder, golden, thick, and nearly reaching her waist. She looked softer than he'd ever seen her. Younger, too, and beautiful. God, he hadn't meant to notice. But the sight of her, quiet and unguarded in the firelight, stole something clean out of him before he could stop it. "You look comfortable," she said. He gave a wry smile. "Not entirely. Still working out how to make the land pay for itself." She stepped inside. The air was warm and still, scented faintly of warm ash and old smoke, the smell of a house that had lived through many winters. A tray sat near the hearth, holding a teapot beneath a thick, quilted cosy, a teacup. and a small plate of biscuits. Juliet crossed to it and poured herself a cup. "Where did this come from?" He nodded. "I asked Mrs. Thorne to leave it by the fire. Said a man might sleep better if he knew a warm cup was waiting. She didn't question it." She raised an eyebrow. "You lied to get tea?" "I improvised." She glanced at the glass in his hand, amber liquid catching the firelight. It wasn't brandy, she noted, the sort of thing a London gentleman might pour. It was whiskey. Of course it was. She settled into the chair opposite him. A beat passed. The silence was easier than it had any right to be. Juliet looked down into her cup. "I'm not used to defending someone else," she said. "I thought it was hard enough protecting my boys, but you make it more complicated." "I never asked you to defend me." "I know." Her voice softened. "That's the problem." Another silence. This one less easy. Juliet sipped. "You meant what you said earlier, about hiding your heart behind manners." Gabriel stared into the fire. "I've been doing it a long time." Juliet swallowed. "I think I have too." Their eyes met. Something hung there, not an invitation, not quite, but a recognition, a mutual understanding of the narrow bridge they were walking. Too much, and they'd fall. Too little, and they'd never reach each other. Juliet set her cup down gently. "You shouldn't have worn the kilt." Gabriel leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I know." But it did make her squirm. A slow grin spread across his face. That it did. Juliet stood. "Good night, Gabriel." She reached the doorway, but paused. She didn't look back, but she said softly, "Don't stay up too long. You're no use to anyone dead from exhaustion." And then she was gone, leaving the door slightly ajar, the fire crackling, and Gabriel's untouched whiskey finally lifted to his lips. Chapter 7. The Polite Distance. Lady Juliet Pembroke woke to a thin frost on the windows, the kind that caught the morning light and held it briefly, like lace. She stayed in bed longer than usual, wrapped in her shawl, listening to the creaks and sighs of the old house as it stretched into morning. The boys were still asleep, or pretending to be. There was a hush to the air that made her feel both cocooned and exposed, the sort of quiet that drew one's thoughts dangerously inward. She didn't think of Gabriel. Not at first. But as the morning slipped into motion, she found herself pacing familiar corners of the house with unfamiliar tension. She straightened the folded papers in the morning room, last week's Chronicle still on the side table, as though someone might return for it. She adjusted the mantel clock in the drawing room and too long before the linen cupboard, not because it needed organising, but because domestic order was one of the few things still within her grasp. She wasn't looking for him, only avoiding the part of herself that had started to. The household stirred slowly. By the time Juliet took her tea in the east-facing sitting room, the one with the stiff cushions and cold floor, Mrs. Thorne appeared with the post. "A letter, my lady," she said, placing it gently on the side table. Juliet didn't need to read the seal to know the sender, Agatha Linfield. Her letters were always the same: expensive paper, careful script, concern sharpened into obligation. She waited until she was alone before opening it. "My dearest Juliet, thank you again for receiving me last week, though I do regret that my timing caught you at such a moment of domestic complexity. It is never easy to manage a household under strain, and I can only imagine how difficult it must be with so few hands to assist you. Still, I confess I was surprised by the presence of Major Pembroke. While I understand he is a relative by marriage, I hope you will not take it amiss when I say that such arrangements, however temporary, are open to misinterpretation. With that in mind, I wish to introduce Colonel Henry Stratton, a man of impeccable reputation and considerable means. Recently returned from India, he is a widower with 3 children and is seeking a practical, well-mannered lady to restore order to his household. I believe the two of you may find a shared sense of duty and an appreciation for stability over sentiment. These opportunities, Juliet, do not come often, and they are not so easily reclaimed once lost. Yours faithfully, Agatha. Juliet read the letter once, then folded it with clinical precision and slipped it between the pages of the household ledger, beneath the tea order, beside the wages list. Out of sight, but not forgotten. By midday, the frost had begun to melt. Pale sunlight broke through the clouds in thin bands, and the ground softened beneath her boots as Juliet walked the edge of the garden. She hadn't meant to go toward the stables, but the path curved that way, and her feet followed it, and before long she heard voices, the unmistakable chatter of boys, and something quieter beneath it. A deeper timbre, steady, familiar. Gabriel. She paused just beyond the hedgerow. Edward stood near the old cart, handing tools to Gabriel with great ceremony. James was half buried in straw nearby, sketching what looked to be a lopsided dragon on a piece of slate. Gabriel crouched beside the wheel, sleeves rolled, expression focused. He hadn't seen her. She could have turned back, could have let the moment pass. But something in her refused. "Major Pembroke," she called lightly. He looked up. His face shifted. Not surprise exactly, but something quieter. A softening. Lady Juliet. The formality again. Polished. Careful. She stepped into the yard. "You're being put to work, I see." Edward beamed. "He said we can take the cart down to the pond if the wheel holds." "It's not a cart, it's a ship," James corrected, without looking up. "He said it can be both," Edward added, clearly impressed. Gabriel stood slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth. Versatility is underrated. Juliet folded her arms, gaze flicking between him and the boys. "You've become very popular." "They're excellent supervisors," he said. "Unrelenting, slightly tyrannical." "They get that from their father," she said dryly, before she could stop herself. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, but it wasn't weightless either. After a moment, she said more quietly, "She's written again." Gabriel looked up. "About me?" "And about a colonel," she said. "Widower, wealthy, 3 children. Apparently, he's a shining example of English decency and looking for a practical wife." "How flattering." "What's more flattering," she added tightly, "is Agatha's concern that your presence might be misinterpreted." He arched a brow. "And is it?" She didn't answer. After a beat, he said more quietly, "Let her misinterpret. I care what happens to you. That's all." That night, the boys fell asleep quickly. The air had turned colder again, and Juliet lit the small fire in her bedroom, watching it crackle into warmth. She didn't answer Agatha's letter. She didn't reread it. She simply sat at her writing desk, pen poised above a blank page, and stared out the window toward the darkened edge of the field. She couldn't see the stables from here, but she imagined the last traces of light there, imagined his voice fading into silence. She thought about the word he'd used. Care. Such a simple word, such a dangerous one. She didn't close the window. She didn't pick up the pen. She simply let the fire burn. Chapter 8. A Quiet Reckoning. Lady Juliet did not rise early the next morning. She heard the house stirring, not just with the familiar creak of old wood and morning footsteps, but something newer. Lighter steps in the corridor. Voices she didn't know. a bucket set down too gently outside the nursery door. New servants, she realised. Not Mrs. Thorne, not the boys. Gabriel had brought in help. She stayed in bed longer than usual, wrapped in her robe, her head against the pillow, eyes fixed on the ceiling. She wasn't tired. She was avoiding the hour that came next, the one where she might see him. By the time she emerged, the tea in the sitting room was fresh. The fire already lit. Someone had swept the hearth, thoroughly, and not in Mrs. Thorne's usual brisk style. The scent of beeswax lingered faintly in the air. A tray waited on the low table. A folded cloth napkin, a silver teapot still steaming, a soft-boiled egg in its cup, toast cut into neat fingers, a small ramekin of preserves, even a slice of ham, warm, fragrant, and clearly not meant for a rushed morning. She hadn't asked for it, but someone had thought she should have it. The boys had vanished to the far field with a pair of wooden swords and a strict oath not to injure each other too badly. Juliet did not ask who had armed them. She already knew. She made her way to the morning room, ledger in hand, intending to work through the last of the January household accounts. But she sat instead by the cold grate, untouched ink beside her, and watched the wind pull thin shadows across the pale rug. She could still hear the word he'd said. Care. Not love, not want, not anything foolish or irresponsible, just that. And somehow it had landed harder than all the rest. Let her misinterpret, he'd said, as if misinterpretation were a luxury she could afford. Later that morning, she crossed paths with Mrs. Thorne near the linen cupboard. The housekeeper's apron was clean. Her hands, for once, were not full. "You're not carrying half the house for once," Juliet said quietly. Mrs. Thorne huffed. "There's more hands now, that's all." The Major brought in 2 maids from the Pembroke tenant farms, sisters, both quick with a broom and quicker with a blush, and a boy from the mills taken on the kindling and boots. "We've not had a footman in years, but the new lad stands up straight enough and doesn't pocket the sugar." Juliet blinked. "And who's paying them?" Mrs. Thorne met her gaze evenly. "You'd best ask the Major, though I doubt he'll take credit." Juliet let it go, but she didn't stop thinking about it. Juliet didn't go riding that afternoon. She told herself it was the cold, the wind had picked up, and clouds loomed low in the west. But the truth was simpler. She wasn't looking for him, only avoiding the part of herself that had started to. Later, she found herself in the small south corridor, the one that led to the nursery and the unused guest rooms. The carpet here was older, worn soft by decades of feet that no longer passed. She paused outside the nursery door. Inside, she heard muffled voices, the boys, at some game. And then another voice, deeper, steady. Gabriel. She leaned back against the wall. He wasn't telling a story, not exactly, but something like it, explaining by the sound of it how the stars could be used for navigation. There was mention of the North Star, of sailors and maps, of how the sky had once been the only clock worth trusting. James interrupted. Edward corrected him. Laughter followed. She didn't move, not even when the door opened and Gabriel stepped into the hall. He stopped short at the sight of her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, "They asked for a story." Juliet nodded. "You gave them a lesson." They didn't notice the difference. His hair was slightly mussed, as though James had tried to climb him, or had succeeded. A faint line of chalk dust clung to his sleeve. Juliet looked away. "I was on my way downstairs," she said, though she hadn't been. Gabriel stepped aside. "Shall I walk with you?" She hesitated, then nodded. They moved slowly down the narrow staircase, the old boards giving slightly beneath their steps. The evening light was pale and thinning, stretching through the long windows as though reluctant to let go. "You were good with them," she said. They're good boys. That's not always the same thing. He gave a small smile. No, it's not. A pause stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but aware. They like you, she said. I'm glad. He hesitated. I like them. Juliet looked at him then, really looked, and saw what he wasn't saying. She looked away again. They've had so little. He stopped at the base of the stairs. You've given them everything. Not everything, her voice caught, not what they miss most. Gabriel's voice was gentle. They don't speak of him much. No, she said quietly. They don't. And neither did she. The lamps were lit early. Wind rattled the shutters, scattering leaves across the drive. Juliet sat in the drawing room with a book she didn't read and a cup of tea gone cold. The boys were asleep. The ledgers balanced. The house for now was still. She heard the study door open sometime after 8. The soft click of the latch, the hush of fire being stirred. She told herself to stay, but her feet didn't listen. Gabriel was at the hearth, coaxing the coals to life. A bottle of whiskey rested on the table, 2 glasses, one full, one waiting. I didn't mean to interrupt, she said. You didn't. He stood and gestured to the second chair. You're welcome to the fire. She sat. The chair remembered other weight, other warmth. Gabriel poured her a measure, no words, no questions. They sat without speaking. He didn't press, just waited, solid and quiet, as if that were enough. Juliet took a sip. The whiskey burned gently. My mother used to say only liars drank after dark. Gabriel's voice was low. Mine said it was the only time a man told the truth. Silence again. Then, they were happy once, she said, before the fever. She didn't cry. I wasn't always like this, she went on. I used to sing. I thought love was enough. Gabriel shook his head. You haven't stopped. You've just forgotten how to move towards something you chose. Juliet looked at him. And you? What do you run from? I ran from death for 10 years, he said. Now I'm here. Why here? His answer was quiet. Because it's the first place I've wanted to stay. She rose, slow, thoughtful. I should go up. He nodded. Of course. She lingered, eyes on the fire. Thank you. For what? For not asking more of me. His answer came gently. I already ask too much by being here. You don't, she said. Not anymore. She crossed to the door, then paused. If I came back tomorrow night, would you mind? I'd mind if you didn't. She didn't smile, but she left the door ajar. Upstairs, the house had settled. Juliet paused outside her son's room. James snored faintly. Edward muttered, then quieted. In her room, she undressed slowly, slid beneath the covers. She didn't sleep right away, but she was no longer alone in the dark. Chapter 9. Signs of Weather. Gabriel had learned early in life not to wait for silence to speak. Silence, in his experience, didn't mean safety, only the space where something sharper might land. So he didn't wait. Not now. Not after that night. He rose early, walked the boundaries, spoke with the tenants, reviewed the ledgers with Sims until the numbers blurred. He inspected tools he didn't need to inspect and listened to complaints that had nothing to do with him. The price of seed, the condition of a roof, an old ewe gone lame. And when the afternoons turned soft with light and the air edged toward frost, He went inside. But not to her. He had not seen Juliet in 3 days. Not properly. A glance in the corridor. A footfall on the stair. Once, her voice through the study wall, low and melodic as she read something aloud to the boys. But never face to face. It wasn't avoidance. Not exactly. It was the space after something breaks and before anything is mended. He gave it to her without complaint. And yet, by the 4th morning, he found himself watching the windows as he passed, listening for her step on the gravel path, pausing just slightly when he passed the morning room, in case. He told himself he was being cautious. What he felt, if he let himself name it, was hope. The south wall of the east garden had collapsed in on itself sometime last winter. Gabriel had noticed it on his 2nd morning at Marchbourne, and had done nothing about it for weeks. It was too low to be a threat, too worn to be worth mending until frost broke. But now the frost was breaking, and he needed something to do with his hands. He shed his coat and rolled his shirt sleeves to the elbows. The sun had edged out briefly, low and white in a cloudless sky, with just enough warmth to sting his fingers back to life. The stone was old. Not a proper wall, not really, more suggestion than structure. But he lifted and reset the fallen pieces with methodical care, steady and slow, the way he might have handled musket shot in a freezing wind, deliberate, silent, precise. He was halfway through realigning the eastern stretch when he heard her. Not her voice, her step. He knew it now. A little hesitant on gravel. Measured, unhurried. Not the step of someone trying not to be seen. The step of someone undecided about whether to turn back. He didn't lift his head. He didn't need to. But when she came into view around the holly bush, gloved hands folded neatly in front of her and brows drawn slightly against the light, he paused, just long enough to look. She wore slate blue today. A darker cloak over a wool walking dress, the hem slightly damp where it had kissed the grass. Her hair was pinned back, but less strictly than usual. A strand had come loose near her temple, lifting faintly in the breeze. She stopped when she saw him. He said nothing. But he stood, wiped his palms on his trousers and tipped his head slightly. Not a bow, not quite. Just enough to mark that it meant something. Her coming. Juliet looked at the wall, then at him. And then, after a breath, "You're building something." Gabriel rested one hand lightly on the next stone. "Rebuilding, or trying to." She nodded, and for a moment, neither of them moved. She hadn't meant to walk that far. She'd meant only to get air, to trace the edge of the orchard path, perhaps circle back past the stables before the wind rose. But she'd seen the coat, discarded on a low wall. The sleeves rolled, the curve of his back as he worked. And she hadn't turned away. Now, standing at the edge of the garden, she could feel the silence settle around them, like breath held between sentences. He hadn't asked why she was there. And that, more than anything, made it easier to stay. The stones had a kind of quiet dignity in his hands. Not elegant. They were rough with moss and years, but steady, grounded. She watched as he lifted another, adjusted its placement with careful fingers, and fitted it back into the curve of the wall. "You've done this before," she said. His voice was low. "You learn quickly when there's no one else to do it." She nodded, looking at the pattern. He'd kept the broken side inward, where the wall met the trees. The clean edge faced out, toward the house. A small, deliberate kindness. A detail no one else might have noticed. She took one step closer. "I never saw my father build anything," she said, the words half surprising her as they came. "He was always riding or reading. He had a tool cabinet in the cellar, but I'm fairly certain it was decorative." Gabriel's eyes flicked to hers, just for a moment. "And your husband?" Juliet's mouth curved, faint and dry. Thomas believed in hiring things done. He preferred results over process. Another beat. The wind stirred the edge of her cloak. She looked at Gabriel then, properly, and said, without defensiveness or weight, "I don't know why I'm telling you that." He didn't smile, but something in his expression softened. Some things ask to be said. That's reason enough. She didn't sit, but she moved to the other end of the wall and touched one of the stones, cool and solid beneath her glove. They worked in silence for a time, not quite side by side, but closer than they had been in days. And when she finally said, "I should go in," it wasn't retreat. It wasn't even hesitation. It was simply true. She turned to go, but stopped after 2 steps. "I like the new edge," she said, without looking back. "The clean side, facing the house." Gabriel's voice came quiet behind her. "I thought someone might." She nodded once, then went on. The path back was gentle beneath her feet. Juliet was halfway up the stairs when she heard Edward's voice, low, urgent, and carrying the unmistakable tone of guilt wrapped in good intentions. "I didn't mean to, Mama. We were only testing." James cut in, breathless. "We didn't know the rope would—" "It was fine until he jumped," Edward insisted. Juliet paused on the landing. A moment later, the boys came into view at the bottom of the stairwell, boots muddy, cheeks flushed, and one of them holding what appeared to be a torn scrap of linen that had once been a curtain tie. Juliet folded her arms. James, always the diplomat, tried a smile. "It was for science." "What kind of science?" she asked coolly. "The sort involving velocity," Edward offered. "And gravity, mostly gravity." Juliet raised a brow. "Are you hurt?" They both shook their heads, too quickly. She sighed, descended 2 steps, and extended her hand. Edward handed over the linen scrap without protest. "Upstairs," she said. "Wash, then the schoolroom." "But it's Saturday," James groaned. "You may write an essay on the scientific applications of gravity," she replied without inflection. 10 sentences, neatly written. The boys trudged upward with the air of condemned men. As Juliet turned to follow, she caught movement in the front hall. Gabriel had just come in, coat dusted with wind, collar still turned. He took in the boys, the muddy trail they'd left, and Juliet standing at the base of the stairs with what looked like the remains of an experiment gone rogue. He didn't laugh, but he did smile. Juliet narrowed her eyes. "Don't say it." He held up both hands. "Wouldn't dream of it." She tried not to return the smile. She failed. The sound of muddy boots faded down the corridor. A door closed. Somewhere upstairs, water splashed into a basin. Juliet lingered at the base of the stairs, the ruined linen still folded in her hand. Gabriel hadn't left yet. He'd set his coat over the arm of the bench by the front door and stooped now to unlace one boot, slow and methodical, as though giving her the chance to speak if she wished to. She didn't. Not yet. But she watched him a moment longer than necessary. The steady line of his shoulders, the way the lamplight caught the edge of his brow. How naturally he seemed to fit in the space that once felt like hers alone. Then she turned, climbed the stairs, and didn't look back. Something had begun to settle, and she wasn't sure yet whether to stand still or reach for it. Chapter 10. What was already there. The house had long since settled. Juliet could hear the hush of it, not silence but the soft, familiar rhythm of Marchbourne at rest. A log shifting in the hearth below, the creak of timber where the wind pressed gently against old beams, a final footstep overhead before stillness took hold. The boys were asleep. She'd checked twice. Edward had both arms flung over the covers. James slept curled around his pillow, knees drawn up, a tangle of limbs and dreams. She'd kissed them each, lingered longer than usual, though she couldn't have said why. She was not restless. She simply wasn't done with the day. She moved through the corridor without a lamp. The path to the kitchen was instinct by now. A turn past the stair, fingers brushing familiar wood, a floorboard she knew to skip. She expected the kitchen to be dark, but there was a glow under the door. Inside, the stove still held a gentle heat. A kettle sat on the hob. A candle burned low on the table. Gabriel was there, jacket gone, sleeves rolled, a mug in one hand. He didn't startle when she entered. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. She shook her head. He poured a second cup without asking and pushed it toward her across the table. They didn't return to the subject of Agatha's advice with any gravity. If anything, the whole matter had begun to feel faintly absurd. 3 children and a fondness for punctual dinners, Juliet murmured, mostly to her tea. I don't know why I didn't leap at the chance. Gabriel looked up, brow raised. I imagine it was the offer of stability over sentiment that swayed you. That, she said dryly, and the suggestion I restore order to his household, as though I were a governess with delusions of elegance. He didn't answer at once, only offered her the jam again, but his smile was unmistakable. Juliet stirred a little honey into her tea. Gabriel reached for the bread knife and began slicing what was left of the loaf. She passed him the jam without being asked. Later, as she rinsed the mugs at the basin, she caught sight of something tucked beside the recipe book, cream-coloured, thick, still neatly folded. Agatha's letter. She paused, then nudged it gently into the kindling basket. Gabriel noticed, said nothing. When she turned back to him, he was closer than before. Not looming, just near. She didn't step away. He searched her face, not for permission, not exactly, only to be certain. And when he kissed her, slow and unhurried, it felt less like a beginning than a return. Several weeks later. The rain held off until just past the vows. Juliet stood with her hand in Gabriel's, the soft pull of the garden wind catching at her skirts. She wore a gown the colour of warm cream, with fine lace at the collar and a ribbon threaded at her waist. Familiar, unpretentious, hers. A wreath of lavender sat in her hair, James's doing, declared essential and placed there with great ceremony. Edward stood beside her like a sentry, curls tamed and solemn as the clergyman gave the final blessing. The ceremony had been short. A few neighbours. A clergyman. Mrs. Thorne sniffling behind her handkerchief as if she'd been waiting years for this particular conclusion. Gabriel wore the Highland dress again, and this time Juliet saw it not as a defiance, but as belonging. It suited him, in a way that needed no explanation. They had not spoken of forever, only of tomorrow, and the one after that. Too late to run, lass, he murmured, and she heard the Highland lilt she so rarely caught from him, softened by feeling and unguarded by formality. Far too late, she replied, and smiled. The wedding breakfast was laid out in the morning room, and never had it looked so fine. The table was dressed in its best linen, the silver polished, the morning light warming the crystal flutes at each place. There was roast ham with clove and potted partridge, coddled eggs, and a game pie so perfectly glazed it looked like something out of a painting. On silver trays sat marzipan sweets shaped like tiny fruits, seed cake dusted with sugar, and a dish of buttery shortbread placed, not without pride, at Gabriel's end of the table. A small plum cake, white iced and decorated with sugared violets, stood at the centre of the table. To the side, someone had arranged oatcakes with honey and crowdie, the soft Highland cheese, brought in specially at Gabriel's request. No sooner had the final dish been set out than Gabriel reached for his sabre. "Don't be absurd," Juliet murmured under her breath. "I would never," he said solemnly, and then, with one clean stroke, knocked the cork clean from the neck of the champagne bottle. Edward gasped. James applauded. Mrs. Thorne shook her head as she reached for the preserves. "Only a soldier would think champagne needs a weapon." "French tradition," Gabriel said, handing the bottle off with a bow. "We do what we must." The teapot made its rounds with quiet ceremony, refilled twice before the plates were cleared. A pot of drinking chocolate nestled in a quilted cosy at the sideboard. The champagne sparkled in every glass, even the boys', though theirs was quietly swapped for watered cider when they weren't looking. Gabriel carved the ham. Juliet poured the tea and made sure every plate found something sweet. Mr. Sims stood, visibly pleased in his best coat, and gave a toast that began with a quiet tribute to Lady Pembroke's steadfastness, wandered through a handful of affectionate digressions, and returned to the point just in time for the second glass of champagne, to wish the couple a future as enduring as the land beneath them. On the mantel rested the wedding announcement. Ivory stock, neatly printed, her name beside Gabriel's in clean, formal type. It had gone to Linfield House. Agatha had not replied. Juliet chose to take that as a blessing. Epilogue, A Place to Grow. Setting, Marchbourne Hall, early summer, 1 year later. The baby had hair like spun honey and a cry that rarely lasted more than a minute. He was not fussy, not yet. And Juliet more than once had whispered a thank you to no one in particular when he nursed easily, or slept longer than expected, or blinked up at her with a furrowed brow and a quiet gravity that already reminded her of his father. Gabriel stood at the hearth with the child tucked against his chest, swaying gently. His boots were muddy from the orchard. His cravat had been abandoned somewhere between the door and the cradle. But his voice, low, steady, slightly rough with wonder, had never sounded more certain. "He'll want to climb things," he murmured, watching the baby's hand curl around his finger. "Trees, fences, the barn roof probably." Juliet, curled in the corner chair with a blanket and a teacup, smiled behind the rim. "He has 2 brothers. He won't lack for poor influence." "I'll build a fence." "You already did. Edward used it to vault into the sheep field." Gabriel chuckled, shaking his head. "And did he escape unscathed?" "Not quite. James had to bribe the ewe with half an apple just to get his boot back." He smiled, tired, but deeply at ease. "I still think we should name him after your father," Gabriel said, glancing over. "It suits him. Strong, steady, the kind of name he can grow into." Juliet tilted her head. "You just described yourself." "Did I?" he said, affecting surprise. "How embarrassing." She laughed, not loudly, but with the sort of warmth that needed no permission. The house was fuller now, not just of people, but of rhythm. Mr. Sims came twice weekly to review accounts and inspect the grounds, always with a pocket full of news and the occasional unsolicited opinion on fencing. Mrs. Thorne reigned over the household with her usual efficiency, her authority extending from linen cupboards to larder inventories. The new maid, Lily, had already learned not to flinch when Edward knocked over the mop pail or James released a frog under the stairs. And still, there was quiet. Moments like this, moments of hush and warmth and something Juliet would never again mistake for stillness. Only peace. The baby stirred. She set aside her cup and crossed to them, one hand brushing Gabriel's arm before reaching for the boy. Gabriel hesitated, only a breath, before surrendering his small bundle. He did so gently, with the quiet care of someone handing over something precious. Juliet settled the child in her arms. Outside, the wind moved through the orchard, lifting the edges of spring. A single bloom, apple or pear, it was too early to tell, clung to the windowpane before vanishing. Juliet looked down at the boy in her arms. And then, not needing to look, she reached back, and Gabriel's hand found hers, fingers threaded without thought. They had not planned this, not exactly. They had built it. There had been no grand moment, just kindness and care and choosing each other again and again. It was enough. It was everything. The end. Thanks for spending part of your day with this story. If you liked it, go ahead and tap that subscribe button. It's free, painless, and oddly satisfying. I'll be here with another tale soon, unless I've floated off into the clouds like this little bell. See you next time.